All right, thank you so much for everybody for showing up here today. I'm glad the rain stopped for everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's event, Navigating Asia, Interdisciplinary Conversations in honor of Ezra Vogel. And so it was a shocking and sad day back in December 20th of 2020 when word spread around the world of the untimely death of Ezra Vogel. And we immediately knew that something had to be done to honor our colleague, friend, and mentor. But it also seemed that this day would never arrive due to the challenges of being unable to gather together in person due to the COVID situation. It was just a few weeks ago, actually, on Saturday, September 24th, that the Harvard community gathered and Ezra's family and friends all came together in Memorial Church to celebrate Ezra's life and career. The sadness and grief of losing Ezra too soon, actually, rarely said for somebody who lived such a full 90 years of life. That sadness and grief will not pass anytime soon. But over the next 2 days, we hope this event will not only recognize and celebrate this special person, but also extend his spirit to reflect on and discuss some of the key issues he was concerned with. Many of those here today attended that wonderful occasion, with some traveling from all over the world to be there. The fact that 2 weeks later they agreed to travel again and to attend this event is testament, I think, to the respect and love that Ezra generated. In the eulogies and speeches at that event, a few words were repeated over and over again: humanity, curiosity, and optimism. So Ezra's extraordinary life, scholarship, and humanity have been captured well in the Remembering Ezra Vogel book that was edited by Mary Brinton, hi Mary, and Marty White, and in the many events that have occurred over the last 18 months around the world. This evening, in this event over these 2 days, especially aims to celebrate Ezra as the inaugural director of the Asia Center and the vision he encouraged of looking at Asia not as isolated entities, but in a transnational context of flows and interrelations. Thanks to the tremendous goodwill of our keynote speaker, all the panelists who warmly accepted my invitations, and to the enduring work of all the Asia Center staff, we were able to bring this event together under a rather short time frame once we were certain that we could hold this event in person. Ezra seemed to intuitively know that institutions that we work within flourish due to the people who constitute them, and that this is something that requires constant effort. So a warm thank you to all of you who did so much to make this event possible. The fact that so many eminent people have agreed to participate in this event is no doubt due to the respect that all have for Professor Vogel. And when I sent out the invitations, I often received excited replies within a day, and in some cases, just a few hours of sending that message out. It was really incredible. Some participants have fit this into an incredibly busy schedule and have gone through great effort to be here for these 2 days. I was just thinking of Professor Yunli, or President Yunli Kim of Ewha Women's University, who was here just 2 weeks ago for the 40th anniversary of the founding of the Korea Institute, who's come back again, so we appreciate that. We are deeply grateful to you all for traveling. Ezra was, if anything else, a convener of talent. One of our primary goals was to mirror as best we could the commitments that Ezra valued and put into action. I'd like to extend a special thanks to Charlotte Eichels. Maybe just a quick hand so people can see you, Charlotte. Yes. For all of her support, and indeed the idea for this event was hatched back in 2020 in the sitting room of her and Ezra's house, where so many gatherings were held over the years. But she also held to the position that this had to be an in-person event since Ezra's entire career was about bringing people together. So we waited, and I'm glad we did. Look around the room, and I hope if Ezra were here and able to look over the schedule and listen to the panels that will take place tomorrow, that he would be pleased by the range of panelists. We have scholars from all over Asia, including Japan, China, Korea, Singapore, and India, in addition to those here in the US. And scholars from all stages of their academic careers. We have diplomats, we have practitioners from the business world, and a balance of male and female presenters, all of which Ezra aimed to engage with, mentor, and support in his career. And we're also very pleased to have Ezra's son, Stephen Vogel, who will be presenting tomorrow, and also his other son, David, and his wife, Ellen, and I think his sister, Eve, will be showing up a little bit later. And we're very glad that they could make it as well. As I pointed out at the reception a couple weeks ago that celebrated Ezra's life, Ezra's Chinese name is Fu Gao Yi, which means Fu, which means teacher or mentor, and Gao Yi means generous conduct. Thus, the teacher with or of generous conduct. And that name, I think, really says it all. In one of my last email exchanges with Ezra, I had written to him to let him know the names and projects of the students who had been selected to receive travel awards from the Asia Center's Ezra F. Vogel Fund. And I was worried that he might be like checking up on the accounting for the fund or, worried about how we were using those funds. But instead, his message read as follows: James, if it is convenient next year when the funds are awarded, could you tell the students I would be pleased to meet them before they go off to the field to give them a little extra push? And I thought this was incredible, just this encouragement to get people out into Asia. Ezra not only sought to bring people who studied Asia together at Harvard, but also those of Asia. He was an optimist through and through. People are fundamentally good and just needed to talk to each other and share ideas. Good people can bring solutions to big problems. That is where understanding comes from. This is why we have structured and entitled this event, Navigating Asia, Interdisciplinary Conversations in honor of Ezra Vogel, with an emphasis on the word conversation. These types of conversations and connections are extremely important, even in or especially because of the challenging times we find ourselves in. Ezra worked not for academic aggrandizement or accolades, though many came, but for a more peaceful world through conversations and friendships and mutual understandings, and we could certainly use more of that today. This year is the 25th anniversary of the founding of the Asia Center, and Ezra served as the inaugural director of the center, and it's our hope that he will be properly honored and the center may one day bear his name. The Harvard University Asia Center was founded during the 1997-1998 academic year as a university-wide interfaculty initiative. From its inception, the Asia Center has been committed to facilitating the cross-cultural study of Asia at Harvard University by fostering research and bringing together faculty members, students, scholars, and other professionals to explore the interconnected histories of the region and the significant issues facing Asia today. And I should also say that Ezra's vision was to build up Southeast Asian studies at Harvard. And at the time when the Asia Center was founded, President Neil Rudenstine, who's here and we'll hear from in just a minute, and also Jeremy Knowles, who was the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Science at that time, Ben Makihara, Bill Kirby, and Ezra Vogel worked hard to raise the founding endowment for the Asia Center. Ezra assisted with President Neil Rudenstine, visited China in 1998, and this was the first time, as far as I know, a Harvard president had set foot in mainland China. He spoke at the 100th anniversary at Beida and met with Jiang Zemin at Zhongnan High, which was a year after Ezra bravely invited Jiang Zemin to give a talk at Harvard in Sanders Theater. That'll be 25 years ago on November 1st, if you can believe that. And this was an event in which President Rudenstine introduced Jiang Zemin. Therefore, we're extremely pleased and honored that former President Neil Rudenstine was willing to join this event and to offer some opening comments to this occasion. Neil Rudenstine is an American educator, a literary scholar, and administrator. From 1968 to 1988, President Rudenstine was a faculty member and a senior administrator at Princeton University. He was then recruited to Harvard to serve as the 26th president of Harvard University from 1991 to 2001. He was not a stranger to Harvard since he had been a junior faculty member in the English department. So think about that for a moment. Can we imagine today a leader of a prominent university like Harvard having at its head a true humanist and a scholar of Renaissance literature and poetry, a patron for the arts, who with his wife and the art historian Angelica Zander Rudenstine did much to expand and promote the arts at Harvard. Often lauded as someone who brought Harvard out of a dire financial situation, it was out of his deep sense of humanity that came a different type of leadership. it is remarkable to note that the types of issues he was concerned with back in the mid-1990s included issues like global trade, climate change, the spread of disease, ethnic conflicts, the role of women in high positions, and concerns for creating a more civil and tolerant campus environment that celebrated and recognized the importance of diversity. Sound familiar? We're still struggling with these issues today. President Rudenstine worked to enable interfaculty collaborations on all those topics and explored how to create new entities where scholars of languages, history, government, economics, law, public health, business, and design could work together with students and visiting fellows to understand an entire continent or region and its cultures. It was this type of vision of breaking down barriers and working across the entire university that became part of the founding mission of the Asia Center as well. Like Ezra himself, he imbued a vision and sense of humanity, optimism, and curiosity. I know that President Rudenstine had once quoted a particular passage from Harvard Law School's so-called most famous dropout, Henry James, who once wrote, "We work in the dark, we do what we can, we give what we have. Our doubt is our passion, and our passion is our task." When James was reflecting on this, he noted that in the life of a writer or an artist or a scholar, the thing is to touch someone, to make them care. President Rudenstine is someone who certainly did that, and we couldn't think of a more appropriate person to offer some opening comments at the outset of this event in honor of Ezra Vogel. So please join me in welcoming former President Neil Rudenstine to the podium. Thank you so much.
Greetings. It's a great privilege for me to be able to say a few words about Ezra, a friend, a colleague, and an extraordinary leader in all of Harvard's East Asian affairs for so many years. Especially, I would say, at the beginning of this particular event, because it was, as has just been mentioned, 25 years ago, Ezra was the founding director of the Asia Center, which of course has just been created thanks to the generosity of so many people, some of you perhaps here, others not. And of course, Ezra did not stop there. By the end, he was eventually the chair or the director or the leader of virtually every entity or program that we have at Harvard in East Asian Studies, whether it was this center or one of the other centers. Ezra did them all and did them superbly. On a more personal level, Ezra, together with Bill Kirby, was central in organizing my and Angelica, my wife's, visit to East Asia in 1996. We went to Hong Kong, to South Korea, to China, to Japan, and to Taiwan. And the arrangements were absolutely impeccable, as you might imagine. Ezra was crucial in arranging our visit to China's President Jiang Zemin in his official residence, where years before Mao Zedong had lived and ruled all of China from those very quarters. 2 years later, in 1998, Jiang Zemin became the first ruler of Communist China to visit the United States, and he chose Harvard as the university that he would like to spend time at. This was clearly an honor, but not without its complexities and its possible hazards. Many people felt that Harvard should not give such a podium to a leader of a communist country. And it was a major forum, of course, because it was the only university he was going to visit for any length of time. Students and others began to organize protests against the visit. And in the face of this situation, it was Ezra who became the president, as he called it, the president of the committee to welcome Jiang Zemin to Harvard. And he, along with Bill Kirby, created a series of public forums attended by a great many students, faculty, and others to help explain why Harvard, with its tradition of free speech, should be allowed to hear China's leader. The forums, fortunately, were enormously successful and paved the way to Jiang Zemin's visit. Possible protests, however, were not the only problem. The Chinese ambassador to the United States at the time was our chief contact person, and he was unfortunately somewhat shrill, even more than somewhat shrill. He insisted that if President Zhang were to come, he should be greeted by children, Chinese children, bearing flowers at the front door of Memorial Hall. He could not be exposed to any protests as he drove around the streets of Cambridge on his way to Memorial Hall where he was going to give his talk, and he could not be asked any questions after his speech. These conditions were, of course, all impossible from our point of view. But we did not want to reject them out of hand because we thought that there might possibly be wiser heads who would prevail if we had some patience. And of course, it was Ezra who, the very next evening, got on the telephone to Beijing saying that we definitely wished that President Jiang Zemin would come to our university, but we needed a slightly different set of conditions in order to greet him. And Ezra, with his wonderful qualities of persuasion, won the day. Because of him, China's president came. He delivered his speech without any flower girls. And there were streets full of protesters who were not disruptive, but who made their presence very loudly known. He even answered 3 difficult but carefully prepared questions at the end of his talk, and then left very cordially while my wife Angelica and I sank in the back seat of a car of the American ambassador to China, who had come for the occasion. So that was only one more of Ezra's triumphs, and a very significant one. As we celebrate him today and tomorrow, I know we shall hear of many of his victories, especially his great intelligence, his acumen, his wonderful publications, his marvelous human qualities, including his deep capacity for friendship. We all miss him greatly. I certainly do. And I want to thank you for inviting me to be part of this wonderfully moving celebration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Rudenstine. So it's now my great pleasure and honor to introduce this evening's keynote speaker. Heng Chee is Professor of Political Science at the National University of Singapore and Ambassador at Large in the Ministry of Affairs of Singapore. Ambassador Chan is currently chairman of the ISEAS-Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore, and from 1989 to 2001, she was Singapore's permanent representative to the United Nations, which made her, incidentally, Singapore's first full-fledged woman ambassador. She then served as ambassador of Singapore to the United States from 1996 to 2012, also making her the first woman ambassador from an East Asian country to be assigned to the United States. You see the pattern here. This was at a time when there were tensions between Singapore and the United States, and she worked extremely hard to improve Singapore's standing in American eyes, which she was successful in doing. Ambassador Chan also served as the executive director of the Singapore International Foundation, director of the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, and director of the Institute of Policy Studies. She was educated at the University of Singapore and Cornell University, and she is the recipient of numerous awards and accolades that include, to name just a few, the Public Administration Medal, a gold medal, the Meritorious Service Medal, the Distinguished Service Order, honorary degrees of Doctor of Letters from the University of Newcastle in Australia and the University of Buckingham in the United Kingdom, and an honorary degree of Doctor of Laws from the University of Warwick. When Ambassador Chan left Washington at the end of her appointment, she received the inaugural Asia Society's Outstanding Diplomatic Achievement Award, the inaugural Foreign Policy Outstanding Diplomatic Achievement Award of 2012, and the United States Navy Distinguished Public Service Award. She has dedicated herself to public service and is noted for her philanthropy and as a patron of the arts. Ambassador Chan has never been one to avoid difficult and challenging issues and has always taken a stand and spoken her mind on critical issues, with some people calling her, quote, intimidating. But her commitments are evident in her books. Her first book, Singapore, The Politics of Survival, 1965 to 1967, was published in 1971. And The Dynamics of One-Party Dominance, the PAP, or People's Action Party, at the Grassroots, which was published in 1976 and which won the National Book Award. Given the tensions among countries in Asia today, we clearly need Ezra Vogel for this generation. And it is precisely this point that former Ambassador Heng Chee will address in her opening keynote address entitled, Why America Needs an Ezra Vogel for Southeast Asia. So now please join me in welcoming Professor and former Ambassador Heng Chee to the podium.
Good evening. President Emeritus Neil Rudenstine, the Vogel family, Professor James Robson, distinguished faculty of Harvard University, friends, admirers, and students of Ezra Vogel. I am very honored to be asked to give this keynote lecture this evening on the occasion of the celebration of Ezra Vogel's life. I feel privileged to have called Ezra Vogel a friend and to be among you. I would like to begin with an explanation for the title of my lecture. Some of you would be intrigued. If you are from Cornell University, you might feel nonplussed given the critical mass of research and formidable reputation of Cornell in Southeast Asian studies, and giant figures such as George McTurnan-Cain, Benedict Anderson, Ruth McVeigh, who made huge contributions to the scholarship of Southeast Asia, particularly on Indonesia. And now there is Tom Pepinski, and there are other younger scholars such as Alan Hicken, Dan Slater, Meredith Weiss, Edmund Mileski, to name a few. I should point out that I did my graduate work at Cornell and was supervised by Ruth McVeigh, whom I consider my mentor, and I interacted with Benedict Anderson and Professor George Cahan. In titling my lecture, Why America Needs an Ezra Vogel for Southeast Asia, I wanted to draw attention to a couple of points. Firstly, it expresses my recognition of the special impact of Ezra Vogel on Asian studies, not only in scholarship, but also as a bridge between scholarship and state, and between state and society. Ezra Vogel was interested to see his research and writings have policy relevance. He hoped to throw light on an issue, bring about greater understanding, to change views and find solutions. His work on China, Japan, and Korea are illuminating on many fronts. His writings are nuanced and incisive and show his deep respect for the culture and the people he studied. Too many studies on Southeast Asia take an antagonistic stance towards the state and are disinterested to examine and analyze state goals and objectives seriously to generate policy insights that might help to produce better outcomes. I am fully aware that the behavior of some political elites may well invite hostility and deserved negative judgments, but not all states are in that category. There is extant scholarship covering society in Southeast Asia, which is of a very high quality, with great insights. Now, through his book, Japan as Number One, Ezra Vogel helped to explain the new Japan, not only to the United States, but to Asia and the rest of the world. For some Japanese, what Vogel succeeded in doing, remarkably, was to describe Japan's modern identity to the Japanese themselves. He characterized and promoted Japan as a most effective and competitive industrial power, but one which could solve the post-industrial problems, such as governing effectively and educating its people. Japan could offer lessons to other countries. In an interview with the Korea Jungang Daily on his edited volume on Park Chung-hee, a figure much reviled by academics in Korea, Ezra said, "I think the job of a scholar is to try describing objectively what we know of and what we have been trying to put together in a more objective account of the history to coordinate understanding of the advantages and disadvantages of the Park era." Ezra tried to understand what leaders and state set out to achieve, and if they were cruel or misdirected, he would say so. I want to round off this portion of my lecture by citing one more quote from Ezra, which illustrates what I admire about his scholarly mission. It is from his book, China and Japan, Facing History. Said Ezra, "I see myself as a friend of both China and Japan. I undertook this study as a bystander, sympathetic to both countries, which I have been studying for more than half a century. I want both countries to succeed. Therefore, in this book, I attempt to the best of my ability to provide an objective understanding of the history of the relations between the two countries in the hope that it will help them improve their relations with each other. I see my mission as seeking truth from facts, not slanting the truth toward the interests of any one country, including my own." Close quote. Now, secondly, it is my view and the view of many thoughtful Southeast Asians that the United States needs to understand Southeast Asia better in its granularity, as different states, as a region, and the potential of the region on its own terms. It is inevitable that Southeast Asia will be viewed in the context of US-China competition, but knowing the players helps. The US often uses the acronym ASEAN to refer to Southeast Asia. That is correct, because that is how we in Southeast Asia refer to the region and use it interchangeably with the geographic region. But it is important to realize that ASEAN is an elite construct, referring to the regional grouping created in 1967 to strengthen regional resilience during the Cold War. It is not a term generally used by the people of Southeast Asia, who think of themselves as Indonesians, Vietnamese, Filipinos, Laotians, Cambodians, Singaporeans. You get the idea. The people from the urban areas of ASEAN member states probably know that there is a ASEAN at the supranational level. Further, there are segments of the population who identify themselves at a sub-regional level, such as Sabahans and Sarawakians in Malaysia, or as ethnic groups and tribes, or through religion. There is nothing equivalent to the sense of being European in the European Union. Southeast Asian countries have different histories, different needs, and are at different levels of development. Knowing these political, social, cultural, and economic layers makes for more effective communication, better policy, and nimble navigation through the political processes. And Ezra Vogel, if he had worked on Southeast Asia, would have helped to provide a bridge between academia and policy. He would have presented the political and economic aspirations of the state in Southeast Asia, as well as channel the expectations and perspectives of a society with the nuances and the feel, yet fully understanding American interests as well. Now I really want to talk of the subject I'm to talk on, which is Southeast Asia, the United States, and China. Now, it is unnecessary for me to tell this audience, but I will say it all the same, that for almost 8 decades, the growth and prosperity of Asia from Japan to India, including China and Southeast Asia, was enabled by the stability provided by the US presence in the region. American leadership and American influence was predominant in shaping the international order and the regional order. But China, as a rising power, has spread its influence, and its active presence is felt in the region, posing a challenge to the dominance of the United States. An integral part of this competition for both the United States and China is to win the mindshare and support of countries and their populations in the region. This is done in 3 ways. First, the 2 great powers will each seek to become the predominant player in as many sectors as possible in the region or the world, and if possible, to marginalize the other. Second, each side will contest to secure the confidence of the region in its leadership. Third, critically, in an age of technology and the internet, it is about the control of narratives concerning events or the developments in the regional and global order and the future trajectory of the region. It is about shaping public opinion, which can then change policies. We have all watched the battle of narratives in the Ukraine war. In Southeast Asia, this is quite aggressively carried out. The US-China strategic competition will generate its own sets of narrative. Southeast Asia is a large part of this audience, and ASEAN is an important swing vote. Lately, the Pacific Islands are seen as a swing constituency too. So paying the right attention to the region is critical. China thinks it understands the region. But like the United States, it too does not quite comprehend the region. But it is big, it is there, it is in the region. So how Southeast Asian countries or ASEAN countries respond to China is slightly different. You know, there's something about the behavior of great powers. Edward Luttwak came up with the concept of great state autism, suggesting that all great states, China, US, Russia, and India, are autistic in their own way. Great states are caught up by their internal activity, so much that leaders and opinion makers do not seriously focus on foreign affairs unless it is a time of crisis. We can expect great powers to stumble around and make mistakes. I would add, great powers do not understand how small or medium powers think and feel. So how is the United States faring with Southeast Asia? You know, whenever the US talks of Asia policy, they're thinking of Northeast Asia. Southeast Asia does not get much attention unless there is a major crisis. The Asian financial crisis brought focus to the region, but it was not the right kind of attention. The United States is not remembered well for this episode in its treatment of Southeast Asian countries in distress, when their currencies devalued and banks collapsed. Amy Seawright, a former DAS in defense in an Obama administration, recognized this as much when she wrote, "Former President Bill Clinton's clinical and detached response to the Asian financial crisis in 1997 and 98 undermined the United States' standing among Southeast Asians hard hit by the crisis. The Washington Consensus, rightly or wrongly, was seen as the root cause of the collapse of the Southeast Asian economies. That the US backed IMF to roll out a tough reform program for Thailand and Indonesia is bitterly remembered by Indonesians. In Indonesia, the economic crisis became a political crisis and swept away President Suharto. 25 years on, it could be argued that Indonesia is a lively democracy today, and the Indonesian economy has a vibrancy to it and is perhaps more sustainable because of the forced reforms. But I am certain that is not how Indonesians reflect on that period of history. Whatever you may say about President George W. Bush's foreign policy, he got the Asia policy right. He began his term fighting terrorism and went to Iraq. But President Bush believed in free and fair trade and the importance of trade as a strategic instrument. He understood that for the US to exercise influence in Asia, it had to expand its economic presence to match the military presence. His administration completed the US-Singapore Free Trade Agreement, I was there, and the US-Chile Free Trade Agreement, demonstrating US trade, leadership, and rules setting. Bush floated the idea of a free trade area of the Asia-Pacific, which encompassed the APEC community. The Bush administration then embraced the idea of P4, consisting of New Zealand, Singapore, Brunei, and Chile, with the ambition to grow it into a larger Asia-Pacific trade agreement. And the United States, joining the P4, renamed this group Trans-Pacific Partnership, began with Bush. The Bush administration's engagement of ASEAN was balanced and constant, with equal emphasis on security and trade. But Secretary Condi Rice's decision to skip 2 out of 4 ASEAN regional meetings during her time in office left a very deep impression on the Southeast Asians. It was during the Obama administration, with the first Pacific president of the United States and Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State, encouraged by Assistant Secretary Kurt Campbell, that the US pivoted to Southeast Asia. They did that even before the administration announced its Pivot to Asia policy in 2011. In 2009, Secretary Clinton became the second US Secretary of State after Dean Rusk to visit Southeast Asia on her first trip overseas. She made a point of visiting the ASEAN headquarters in Jakarta and subsequently attended all the ASEAN regional meetings. State Department, during her time in office, established policy talks with all 10 countries in ASEAN at different levels of seniority, hoping this would become institutionalized and ensuring that US officials would visit the region, but the policy talks were discontinued afterwards. US foreign and trade policy can change from administration to administration, and do, even with the same party, and definitely when the rival party succeeds. Therefore, encouraging the impression that US interests in the region is episodic. The second Obama administration set out to implement the Pivot to Asia, with greater focus on China and Asia and a more robust policy on the South China Sea. And you all know Defense Secretary Ash Carter, who is at Harvard, who in May 2015 warned China to halt its island building in the South China Sea. And Secretary Carter bluntly reaffirmed US intentions to remain the pivotal military power in the region. You remember his saying, "We will fly, we will sail, we will operate here in the Pacific as we always have." And in 2015, the Obama administration authorized 2 FNOPs operations and 3 in 2016. FNOP's operations are intended to challenge maritime claims it considers excessive under international law. And each FNOPS in 2015 and 2016 sailed within 12 nautical miles of the islands and reefs claimed by China in the Paracel and the Spratly Islands. Now, the region refrained from issuing statements to endorse the FNOPS, not wanting to anger China, but quietly, countries in ASEAN welcomed the decision. President Obama, like his predecessor, understood that trade is strategic. It is a tool, and he wanted to complete the negotiations for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But President Trump, on his first day in office, took steps to withdraw from TPP to fulfill his campaign promise. This, together with his call for America First, elevated concerns that the United States would dramatically reorient its trade policy and become more protectionist in its dealings with the rest of the world. TPP countries determined to keep the region open to trade and investment scrambled to save the agreement. Japanese leadership helped to usher the emergence of the CPTPP in its place. That is TPP 11 minus the United States, and ASEAN members stepped up its efforts to conclude the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, to counterbalance the growing protectionism in the US. Now, in spite of this unhospitable beginning, unexpectedly, the Trump administration in its first year maintained the momentum of engagement with Southeast Asia. President Trump welcomed the leaders of Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, and Singapore to the White House first year and attended the US-ASEAN Leaders Summit in Manila in 2017 and the APEC Leaders Summit. He made both. But the engagement with Southeast Asia was overshadowed by his focus on North Korea, a trade war with China, and promoting the free and open Indo-Pacific framework. ASEAN did not warm up to the FOIP, as it was clearly purposed to contain China. US-ASEAN relations slid rapidly after that, with the president skipping the 2018 US leaders meeting. Representing him, he sent Mike Pence, and the year after that, he sent Robert O'Brien, the NSC advisor. ASEAN leaders canceled the summit, saying O'Brien was not the appropriate counterpart of the leaders. Well, for Southeast Asia, the United States was becoming a less predictable trade partner. The uncertainty stemming from US-China tensions. Export-dependent economies like Vietnam, Malaysia, and Singapore ship components to China for assembly, which are then exported to the United States. That would incur costs due to the trade war. And trade redirection was also possible towards suppliers that would exempt them from tariffs, therefore benefiting countries not involved in the trade conflict. Now, the Biden administration swiftly projected America's intention to re-engage ASEAN closely and at the highest levels. In 2021, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin visited Singapore and Vietnam. Vice President Harris visited Singapore and Vietnam, followed by Secretary Blinken's stops in the Philippines, Indonesia, and Thailand. And he will be at the Cambodia Leaders Summit. And President Biden is expected to go to Indonesia for the G20 summit. 23 visits to ASEAN countries within 2 years by senior officials of the Biden administration is unmatched by previous administrations, suggesting that the Biden administration has every intention to compete with China for a mindshare of Southeast Asia by being there. The visits should, however, be accompanied by a clear strategy to win confidence in US leadership in the long run. Now, in Asia, countries look to the stabilization of the US-China relationship after the chaos of the Trump administration. That Biden continued much of the Trump policies on China and went further was a disappointment to the region. He did not reduce tariffs and maintained a firm confrontational position on security matters. In the technology sphere, the Biden administration is moving towards further decoupling. China is also taking the initiative to decouple on its own terms. Techno-nationalism is a new strategy, and a technology war may well result. President Biden has been extremely effective in mobilizing European allies, unifying NATO to push back Russia over Ukraine, and is building a new architecture, security architecture, in the Indo-Pacific. The Biden administration swiftly revised the Trump Indo-Pacific strategy and stressed working with regional partners, including ASEAN. He wanted to refashion the Quad, establish AUKUS, and launch the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF. You've heard of this lately. The Quad under Biden did not mention China, but cooperation by the members would cover humanitarian and global commons agenda, such as global health, climate change, emerging technology, infrastructure, cyber, education, and clean energy. This could be a response to the disinterest of ASEAN to participate in the Quad under the Trump administration. The recasting has elicited more positive feelings from ASEAN. AUKUS drew critical reactions from some ASEAN countries, but time and explanations have quietened the misgivings. IPEF was welcomed by the regional countries, relieved that the United States was finally moving on the track of economic engagement. IPEF is an economic framework covering 4 pillars: trade, supply chains, clean energy, and fair economy. But the weakness of IPEF, and those of you who work on it know, is that it has no market access. Nonetheless, 12 countries are joining the United States, and 7 are ASEAN countries. So ASEAN is buying into IPEF. I have circled around the discussion of US political and strategic engagement, and for 7 decades, US military and strategic and security engagement has been anchored by its bilateral treaty alliances with Japan, ROK, Australia, and New Zealand, Thailand, and the Philippines. In recent years, Thailand has moved much closer to China, and President Duterte pivoted to China and back. Singapore is a defense partner, not a treaty ally of the US, and has stepped up defense collaboration in traditional and non-conventional security. Efforts to expand security activities with other Southeast Asian countries are still in the early stages. There are multilateral military exercises which are going on, but Islamophobia policies in Washington, keeping Muslim immigrants out, or Operation Iraqi Freedom, and America's handling of the Israeli-Palestine issue dampen enthusiasm amongst the Muslim Southeast Asians to work with the United States on security. China's rise and continued assertive and aggressive activities in the South China Sea, however, sent more ASEAN states to work with the United States. Washington has assiduously engaged Vietnam, both under the Trump and Biden administrations. And in August this year, the United States and Indonesia held its annual bilateral military drill called Garuda Shield, started in 2007, but it expanded to include 10 participating countries: Japan, Australia, Singapore, Canada, France, India, South Korea, Papua New Guinea, Timor-Leste, and the United Kingdom. And this drill is now upgraded and called Super Garuda Shield. What of China? Southeast Asia's engagement with China was frozen with the establishment of the People's Republic of China, which had an explicit goal of promotion of revolution abroad. Several of the Southeast Asian countries had to counter communist revolutionary underground movements supported by the CCP. Full normalization of relations began after the US-China détente. But earlier geopolitical shifts, such as Britain's withdrawal east of Suez and Nixon's announcement of the Guam Doctrine in 1969, may have convinced regional leaders to diversify diplomatic relationships. Malaysia was the first to establish diplomatic relations with China in 1974. Each ASEAN member state had to define the relationship it wanted with China. Each had its own history and concerns. In ASEAN, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore have a more complicated relationship with China because of its sizable ethnic Chinese population. Foreign policy is impacted by domestic dynamics. Indonesia went through the Gestapo coup in 1965, which was alleged to be mounted by PKI, the Communist Party, against the TNI, the Indonesian generals, supported by Beijing. Several generals were murdered. What followed was a massacre of PKI members and a large number of its ethnic Chinese population. The New Order government immediately froze the existing bilateral relationship established in 1950, viewing China as a primary external threat to Indonesia. But this policy was overturned when democratic politics arrived in 1998, and subsequent Indonesian presidents sought closer relations with Beijing, especially with China's growing economic power and assistance to Indonesia during the Asian financial crisis, the tsunami, and the COVID pandemic. Malaysia fought an insurgency against the Malayan Communist Party from 1968 to 1989, supported by the PRC, until 1974, when Malaysia established diplomatic relations with China. Aside from changes in the external environment, domestic political exigencies persuaded Malaysia to move closer to China. Firstly, the Razak government hoped a good relationship with China would end its support of the Malayan Communist Party, who were mainly ethnic Chinese. Secondly, the Malay-dominated government had implemented a policy to underscore the primacy of Malay interests in the plural society and reaffirm a strong affirmative action policy for the Malay population. Better relations with China was meant to create optical balance to win the support of the domestic Chinese population. But successive governments in the 1980s distrusted Beijing's intentions towards its ethnic Chinese population. From 1990 onwards, the economic growth of China convinced the political elites that China, with its huge market, would be a strong economic power for Malaysia. The territorial disputes in the South China Sea with China remained issues. But overall, Malaysia did not and does not take a confrontational approach, preferring diplomacy. In the last 2 decades, from Prime Ministers Badawi to Najib, and even during the second Mahathir government to the present, bilateral relations have remained warm and cordial. What about my country? At independence, Singapore, with a Chinese majority population, strove to insulate the new city nation state from China's overt and active influence. Then Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew wanted to buy time to build a distinct identity for the new nation, reflecting its multiracial, multicultural, and multi-religious population, and rooted in Southeast Asia. The decision to keep English as the language of the civil service, courts, and school was politically brilliant, which helped to shape the Singapore identity. Singapore was the last country in ASEAN to establish formal diplomatic relations with China on October 3rd, 1990, though we always had a commercial representative in Beijing since 1981. But Singapore, for defense and security reasons, aligned itself at independence with the five-power defense agreement, which was Britain, Australia, and Britain, Australia, Malaysia, Singapore, New Zealand. But we saw the US as the only credible presence to oppose communism in Asia during the Cold War. Lee Kuan Yew was the most articulate voice arguing for the need of an American presence in the region. He was also the most credible voice explaining and defending China's rise and the need for the West to engage with China. Singapore has strong, deep, and broad ties with China, just as it has equally strong, deep, and broad ties with the United States. In fact, the G2G relationship with the United States is much older than with China. Singapore has sought to balance its relationship today with both the United States and China. Now, Vietnam, I'm not going to go through all the 10 countries. Never fear. Vietnam has a checkered and complex relationship with China. The more recent history has been marked by ideological clashes and even war. The Sino-Soviet split left Vietnam in a difficult position, having to choose between two paramount allies. But the Soviet Union, as the main source of assistance when the US intensified its war, made the Vietnamese turn to the Soviet Union. It refused to take sides in the dispute. The Sino-Soviet rapprochement created further doubts in Vietnam about China's position on its own revolution and reunification. So the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia with Soviet backing invited the Chinese invasion of Vietnam in 1979, resulting in a total fracture of the relations, which lasted more than a decade. The loss of its primary ally following the dissolution of the Soviet Union and Vietnam's own poor international standing stemming from its invasion and occupation of Cambodia led to the normalization of ties between China and Vietnam in 1991, but only after Vietnam exited from Cambodia. Relations remain troubled as China pushes the envelope in its dealings with Vietnam in the South China Sea, as it does with other ASEAN claimants. Discord erupts, but Vietnam is sufficiently skillful to keep a delicate balance in its relationship with China. This is done by managing the bilateral relationship at two levels, the party-to-party level and the state-to-state level. When the state relationship becomes brittle over territorial disputes, the party-to-party relationship can help mitigate the differences. But no breakthrough has been arrived at. Vietnam has pursued a foreign policy by choosing relationships which enhances its security interests today, leaning heavily on ASEAN and developing a closer relationship with the United States. There is no doubt that China's steady and spectacular economic growth since 1978 has left an impression on Southeast Asia. China was a challenge and opportunity from the start, and ASEAN established dialogue relations with China in 1991, saying we will socialize, fancy that, we will socialize and integrate China into the regional architecture, and we proposed so many. ARF, ASEM, EAS, ADMM+, free trade agreements and groupings, and RCEP. I should point out that except for ASEM and RCEP, the United States is also a member of these groupings, so we did not exclude the United States, and the idea was to bring both parties in. ASEAN is a priority in China's foreign policy, and China has used trade and economic partnerships to deepen and intensify its ties to the regional countries. In fact, ASEAN-China relations were warm and cordial once China decided to join the international economic system. China did not put a foot wrong for a couple of decades, was low-key, accommodating, and mindful of the interests of Southeast Asia, guided by Deng Xiaoping's dictum. But its sweeping sovereignty claims in the South China Sea antagonize the ASEAN claimant states and other nations who see the freedom of sea lanes at stake. Movement on the negotiations for the Code of Conduct remains stuck in spite of rounds of COC negotiations. China clearly needs to understand Southeast Asia better. When Deng Xiaoping came to Southeast Asia in 1978 to rally regional countries against the Soviet Union and Vietnam, Lee Kuan Yew warned him Southeast Asians were more likely to rally against China for their subversive broadcasts aimed at overseas Chinese. Deng stopped the broadcasts, and in 1980, Deng Xiaoping promulgated the first PRC citizenship law, which recognizes the single citizenship, not dual citizenship. But President Xi Jinping, in effect, reversed this by advocating all Chinese 中华民族 should support the China dream. China has also started offering green cards to all foreigners working and living in China. Now, some Southeast Asian countries would have noted that the Chinese ambassador to Malaysia in 2015 went to Petaling Street, which is the heart of Chinatown, ahead of a pro-government demonstration with racial overtones, speaking out against racism in Malaysia. He riled the Malay politicians who had come round to looking favorably on the China-Malaysian relationship. President Xi Jinping is fundamentally different from his predecessors. That he is going for an unprecedented third term did not send shock waves through Southeast Asia as it did in the West. His ambitious Belt and Road Initiative and AIIB evoked strong interest and was seen as opportunities to access resources for constructing infrastructure, which otherwise would not be built. But given the stringent conditions of World Bank and IMF, every ASEAN country participates in the BRI with several projects, and China is apparently going through BRI 2.0, where it amends its policies. They have been accused of debt trap diplomacy. They themselves have not been able to redeem their loans, and there are many non-completion projects. The question is, does China learn? We think China learns. But in ASEAN, we have shown that countries can have agency even when you do BRI projects. Malaysia under Mahathir in 2018 cancelled, suspended, and renegotiated some of the BRI projects from Najib Razak's tenure. Slashed the money, from 15 billion to 20 billion. So countries can push back. Now, let me share some numbers with you, which shows where China and the United States stand in competition and in the competition and influence game in Southeast Asia. I will quote the ISEAS survey, which is of Southeast Asian elites, opinion from the bureaucracy, think tanks, university, media, and business sectors, people who watch the foreign policy and strategic policies closely. Let's just take a look at China and the US in trade and investment in the region. Can I have the slides, please? Okay, this is ASEAN trade in goods, US and China. Red is China, blue is United States. 2019, from 2010, 2019, steadily, China has built its trade, doubled practically from 2010. Slide 2, please. It shows ASEAN states' top trading partners. Red is China, blue is the US. China is the top trading partner in the first 5 at least, but top trading partner of most of the ASEAN states. In 3 states, the US is not in the first 5. It's Myanmar, Laos, and Brunei. Next slide. Now, this is cumulative FDI flows, and the picture is reversed. Blue, where are we? Sorry, slide 3. Yes, cumulative FDI. Blue is the United States, red is China. And clearly, the US outperforms China for cumulative FDI in ASEAN. Slide 4. So this is on which country enjoys the most economic influence in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asians rate them. In fact, 76.7% in 2022 thought China had the most economic influence in Southeast Asia. Only 9.8% thought America was the most powerful influence. And you think, why is that when you are tops in FDI inflows? Next slide, please. However, the attitude towards the power's economic influence, there is concern about China's growing economic influence. In 2022, 64.4% in ASEAN expressed concern about the growing regional economic influence. 35.6% welcome the Chinese influence. Now you look at the United States column. In 2022, 68.1% welcome the growing regional economic influence. Only 31.9% said they were worried about US influence. So China is the strongest influence, but they are worried about it. Next slide, slide 6. Which country exerts the most political and strategic influence in Southeast Asia? And here, it is still China, but the US political and strategic influence is about 29.7%. Not so bad. Next slide, please. Attitude towards the country's political and strategic influence. Again, Southeast Asians are concerned with China's growing political and strategic influence. Next slide, please. Oh, this is interesting. If ASEAN were forced to align with one of 2 strategic rivals, who would you choose? 57% chose the United States, 43% chose China. Okay, slide 9, the last slide. This is a trust and distrust rankings of major powers in the region. Japan is the most trusted, China is the most distrusted. India is next, But US, EU, trusted, and Japan is the least distrusted. So that's how it goes, yeah? Now, strategic thinkers constantly want to know who will Southeast Asia choose? And I would say choice, and Southeast Asian countries say, please don't ask us to choose. But choice will not be made by ASEAN members sitting at a conference table to cast their votes. It won't happen that way. Choice occurs when the United States and China each propose initiatives and put them before the region. So we will tick off the initiatives. Countries will sign on to what is in their interest. Then one day, perhaps, we will see a tipping point. The question is whether security partnerships count for more than economic partnerships, because they reveal alignment. Some have argued that economics is hard power too, as much as defense and security. And Southeast Asian countries have all expressed they want good relations with the United States and China. So where do we choose? We don't want to choose. The Ukraine war demonstrated that most countries want to remain independent with a sense of agency to choose whatever best serves their national interests on specific issues. So the trend could be no one wants to choose. Countries want to be non-aligned or multi-aligned. I have called this the third space. Countries want to enter the first space, not the space of the US and the West or China and Russia. They want to remain in the center in the third space. And I think this will become more and more the trend. Now, I cannot conclude this lecture without touching on Taiwan briefly. On Taiwan, it is true to say that all ASEAN countries accept a one China policy and that Taiwan is part of China. They would like to see the issue of Taiwan resolved through peaceful means. They followed the Nixon visit to China closely and are generally familiar with the terms of détente and the Shanghai communiques. The region viewed the Pelosi visit to Taiwan as provocative and unnecessary. The stability of the Taiwan Straits impacts on the entire region, and the outbreak of conflict would change the chemistry of the region in ways not yet predictable. The region is watching the escalation of responses on both sides, the US and China, with a sense of foreboding. All the countries hope that the US and Western support for Taiwan would add to the stability of the Straits and not encourage a reckless dash for independence, which will force a Chinese retaliation. Now, I hope I've given you a sense of Southeast Asia with all its complexities and expectations and conveyed the special nuances of our positions. Southeast Asia has worked with the United States and welcomes the US presence, particularly to balance the growing Chinese presence. But they also want to work with China, the new risen power. In the spirit of Ezra Vogel's scholarly mission, which was to promote better understanding of Asia and better policies between state and state, I will conclude with 4 messages for the United States, shared as a good friend who has studied, lived, and worked for a long time in your country. First, engage comprehensively with Southeast Asia. Economics is important, trade is strategic, not just security. In Southeast Asia, trade is understood by the population and involves many sectors in every society. China's trade with Southeast Asia will grow further, but the region will want to diversify its trading partners to acquire some balance in our trade ties. Second, as the competition between the US and China gathers momentum, values become an increasingly important part of the argument. President Biden has presented the bilateral competition as a global struggle between democracies and autocracies. This pitch may have resonance in Europe, but in Southeast Asia and other regions, it does not play well, and the US would have narrowed the circle of strategic partners and friends. These countries are proud of the political systems they shaped, which work in their context and enjoy legitimacy among the people. At the same time, they see some democracies in the West faltering and struggling to reform themselves. Third, it is very clear in the battle of narratives, the US is outcompeted by China. The statistics tell the story of the US being the cumulative best investor in Southeast Asia ahead of China for the last 10 years. Yet Southeast Asians believe that China is the most influential economic power in the region. Trade seems to have made a big impression, but investment not as much. Or maybe it's the way you invest privately. America must focus on putting out a better narrative and a sticky one. Fourth, the United States is the most powerful country in the world. Militarily, your capability is still without parallel. The level of sophistication and advancement of US weapons and equipment is visible at every war. In military expenditure, the US is unsurpassed if we add up all the military expenditures of the rest of the world combined. The US economy is resilient, and the US dollar is still the reserve currency of the world. Some countries may seek to spread their risk by denominating trade in different currencies. The Ukraine war sanctions would have shocked some countries to try to circumvent the stranglehold of the United States and the West on the excess and flow of their currency reserves. Yet, ironically, the United States does not seem to portray itself as a strong power. Instead, the tone sounds defensive. The rhetoric is China is stealing a march on the United States in every dimension, and there is almost a desperate attempt to push back. China is catching up, but the US is still ahead. We have heard the report that every time Pentagon runs a war game on the Taiwan Straits, the US loses to China. That is hard to believe, given the state of American military capability and its preparedness. Is it to convince Congress to provide Pentagon with more funds? But speaking in this way has a knock-on effect and feeds into the discourse of a declining power. And this comes back to your narrative. Now, I made my 4 points. My lecture has been titled Why America Needs an Ezra Vogel for Southeast Asia. It is deliberately provocative, and I hope I have nudged policymakers and students of Asia in the US who wish to see the US gain wider support for their leadership in the region to dwell on the perspectives of each Southeast Asian country and as a grouping in this changing world. Thank you.
So thank you very much to Ambassador Chan for those interesting comments and also setting the tone and putting many of the issues on the table that I think will occupy our conversations tomorrow. And also a special thank you to President Rudenstine for his opening remarks about Ezra and also for his support for the founding of the Asia Center back when he was serving as president of Harvard University. So I'd like now to invite everyone to join us for a full day of panels and conversations tomorrow. And in the spirit of Ezra's famous indefatigable work ethic, it will be a long day that will begin at 8:45 a.m. But before that, and now, I would like to invite everyone to join us in the concourse outside of this room for a reception. So please join us out there if you can make it, and we'll hopefully see you all tomorrow. Thank you again for joining us.